over here. Hey, team. Hello, everybody. Let me go live over here so that we can let our friends on Instagram join us today. Okay, so welcome to today's live. Today we have a very special guest, which is Dr. Brenna Hicks. If you are not yet familiar with Dr. Brenna and her work, and if you have kids or aspire to have kids, today is your lucky day. Dr. Brenna is the real deal. She is the kid counselor. She hosts not one, but two podcasts, one for the general population seeking to improve their parenting, and another for therapists seeking to become more effective in child-centered play therapy. She teaches, she speaks, she has a private practice at brennahicks.com. Is there anything else that I'm missing, or did that pretty much cover it, Dr. Brenna?
I think that's it. All things related to kids and families.
and extra credibility from being a mom yourself. I think that's worth something.
I think so, yes. It
Awesome.
helps.
Well, so today, for my regular listeners here, as you know, we featured a wonderful interview with Dr. Brenna on Monday's episode of Love, Happiness, and Success, where you spilled lots of tea, Dr. Brenna, about how to utilize best practices from child-centered play therapy into parenting in order to create a more peaceful family environment. And you also spent a lot of time, which I was so grateful for, demystifying what happens in really good play therapy, because I think, unfortunately, it's so experiential. I think it's hard for therapists to articulate sometimes, but also there's just a lot that the general public doesn't understand. And so I think it's easy for parents with sincere intentions to get help from their kids can get connected with providers or modalities that don't quite move the needle for them. So anyway, I was just so grateful for everything you shared.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was, to me, that's one of my greatest gifts that, I'm able to share with people
Yeah.
is there are very clear expectations. There's
Mm.
very clearly a model. There's very clearly goals and objectives. And so we've had far too many families come and say, I've already been in therapy or I've already been in play
Right.
therapy. And when I find out what their experience was like, it was not what they had
I know.
hoped.
Yeah.
And so there really does need to be a lot of awareness of what it should be, what it should look like, and what that experience is meant to be.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom today. And you guys listening, just joining us now, if you have questions about play therapy, or if you have questions for Dr. Brenna, maybe you're a parent who's hitting a rough patch, maybe running into some friction points with your kids, this is a fantastic opportunity for you to ask Dr. Brenna questions and get her insights onto some easy changes you can make at home that smooth things out. And thank you guys for joining us today. We have a few friends here. Hello, Julie. So glad you could join. Donzi's here. We have Ty. Let's see, Carla and Charm. We have some friends on YouTube just joining us. So if you're just joining us today, it's all about using ideas from play therapy at home. So where should we begin? Do you guys have some questions for Dr. Brenna? Is it safe to assume you're joining us today because you're parents? If so, I'd love to hear about your experience, and we'll start our conversation. And maybe, Dr. Brenna, I could just ask you a question. In your experience, I hesitate to even ask because I'm sure this is unhelpfully broad, but are there even just a handful of the usual suspects? Like if parents are experiencing some of the super frustrations, kids tantruming or having freakouts, or just like it's difficult to get them to follow simple routines, or like put the toys in the basket, turning into power struggles. Are there even just a couple of things that you found in your experience to be the usual suspects, or at least things to experiment with first at home?
Sure. How long do you have? No, I'm just kidding. So, so I would, if I had to filter and funnel to what I would consider to be my top reasons, it's almost always that the child does not feel heard, understood, or validated. And then also that it is then emerging as a power struggle as a result. So one or both, and they usually work in tandem. So it's usually a both and, but sometimes it's just that kids truly don't feel heard, understood, or validated. In other words, they really, really are excited about watching that show, and they're told to go take a bath. And the show is so meaningful and so exciting for them. They're emotional beings. So whereas we could just like pause a show and not care, kids really would struggle to do that because emotionally they're so invested. And so when we say, no, it's time to go take a bath, they feel completely invalidated and completely misunderstood because we can dismiss it as insignificant, but for them, it's extremely significant. And so validating feelings is a really helpful tool there. You really wish that you could watch more. You love that show. You enjoy that program, whatever. Even that diffuses the intensity of emotions. And then often what will happen is because they feel out of control over the fact that they can't watch their show anymore, they feel they need to grasp at any measure of control that they can take. And then it becomes a power struggle. So if we recognize it for what it is, they're grasping at power, we can provide them with choices, which immediately returns some power to them, and it will diffuse the intensity of the power struggle.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is incredibly helpful so that kids, they are having experiences that are different than ours, that, are different than adult experiences. They're excited about things. We need to recognize that, validate that, and that our ability to do that well is something that can help avoid a power struggle. And that makes a lot of sense. And I have other questions coming up that would love to ask you. And team, those of you who have joined, hello, Nelika, Mademoiselle Anna, and Sopita. Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're visiting with Dr. Brenna Hicks, the kid counselor herself, to tackle some, parenting questions. Okay, so Dr. Brenna, not that this has anything to do with my own 6-year-old. I'm asking for a friend right now. But in the event that one has a child who is wonderfully confident, assertive, a commanding little presence, and very happy to be who she is, tell you exactly what she wants, like my child, so what I run into, and hear other people running into, are kids who are like, no, I don't want to do that. So for example, let's clean up your room, put the books away, help me, get the stuffies back in the basket. And it's really just a simple, no, I don't feel like doing that. And it could certainly turn into a power struggle, but we could be like, oh, you really don't feel like doing that. Nope, don't want to do that. And I start to feel like I'm at a loss because then it's like, okay, kid, we actually need to do this. Get in here. And validating her feelings. She would really rather be doing something else and doesn't see the value of picking up her room the way that I do. And this could extend to so many things like eating reasonably nutritious foods, like it's time to get ready for bed. What do you do with that?
Well, we have to recognize kids have control over this many things. So hold on, you couldn't see my hand. 5. So they are in control over eating, sleeping, toileting, obedience. And it's very, very small and finite, the number of options they have. So in that scenario, I don't want to go to bed. I don't want to eat that food. I don't want to clean up my toys. I don't whatever. It's still a power and control struggle, which can be identified as confidence, and she knows who she is, and she's just very outspoken. Yes to all the above, but it's still at its core the only measure of control that she has. And so if we recognize everything through the lens of kids aren't rational and they're going to take power wherever they can get it because most often they feel powerless.
Yeah.
Our most appropriate and effective approach is going to be set expectations ahead of time, not in the moment. A really powerful rule of thumb that we teach is when a child is drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. So when she's already refusing to clean up toys, when she's already refusing to eat her dinner, that's a really difficult time to have any important lesson
That's a
sink
good
in.
point. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so if the child's already drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. So we have to set expectations neutrally, calmly, and when it's an appropriate time. And if it's important, we take time for it. So sometimes that's saying, okay, I know sometimes it's really difficult when you're right in the middle of doing something for you to clean up your room, even though it's time to clean up the room. So you approach it at a completely neutral, calm time intentionally. And what that allows you to do is approach it in a way that the child will receive, the child can receive, and then you set a limit with choices. So again, choice giving is the antidote to power struggles. Why? Because you're giving children control. However, it's not unadulterated control. It is, I am okay with the choices that I'm providing you. I am okay with you choosing either one. So parent still has parameters, but now all of a sudden the child says, okay, I can make a choice here. I have some control and power. So you might say, you really don't want to clean up sometimes, but at some point today, it's going to be time to clean your room. So you can choose to clean your room at 2 o'clock today, or you can choose to clean your room at 3 o'clock today. Which do you choose? You would be okay with either one. It might be 11 in the morning. And so then she has ownership in the outcome. She has buy-in because she's already made the choice. And here's the beauty of this. You've given her control, she's taken it, she's made a choice, and therefore you fall back on the choice. So she's probably going to say 3 because most kids are going to push it off as far as they can. So you say you can choose 2 or you can choose 3. She's going to choose 3. So 3 o'clock rolls around and you say, okay, you've chosen to clean up your room at 3 and it's 3 o'clock. Sometimes kids will just know they made the choice and they will just be compliant because they had power. But some kids will go, no, I'd really like to wait. And you say, you'd really like to wait, but you chose to clean your room at 3. So it's time to clean your room. And you can default back to the choice that was made. There is immediate ownership and therefore acceptance of outcome when a child has already made a choice. Self-responsibility is very powerful. So when the fact that she's already declared she's choosing to clean her room at 3 o'clock, she knows the choice that was already made. And you can fall back on that over and over again. But if you wait until you say, you need to clean your room right now, and then it becomes a power struggle, it's far harder to backpedal out of that than it is when you've already set the expectation earlier in the day.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. That makes a lot of sense. And getting buy-in, negotiating, eliciting agreements earlier on in the process really increases the likelihood that it will go well. So that's a great piece of advice. I'm going to try that. I'll let you know how it goes.
Please do.
So team, if you're just joining us, hello, everyone. If you're just joining the conversation, we are visiting with the kid counselor, Dr. Brenna Hicks, and she is available to answer some parenting questions between now and the bottom of the hour. So Dr. Brenna is all yours for about the next 15 minutes. And if there are any questions that you have, parenting, thinking about getting your kid in treatment, how to deal with issues that are coming up at home, we would love to hear them so that Dr. Brenna can answer. And Brenna, just so you know, we have a weird little lag between what we're doing here now. It takes a minute or two for our friends, particularly on Instagram, to be able to have the opportunity to respond. So we're going to give them just a minute. Oh,
Sure.
We have a listener with a couple of questions that I need to pull up on my phone. Okay. First of all, this is a good one. How do you help a 9-year-old be comfortable with sleeping in her own bed alone? That it almost feels like sleep training needs to start all over again, but this time with a kid who has had big emotions and will legitimately not sleep alone. This is a common thing that I hear about, like even elementary school age kids have this attachment to being close to their parents at night. What's your take on that?
So I think it was already identified in the question. It's almost always kids with super deep feelings, and they're usually pretty highly sensitive. And
Okay.
so what happens is it naturally evolves organically to start.
Okay.
So at one point, child came into mom's bed, or mom came into child's room, and it was a comfort, it was a relief, it was some kind of emotional crutch that made whatever the situation was better. And what ends up happening is, without an emotional IQ, without an emotional vocabulary, all of a sudden now the child becomes conditioned that they need that. And so therefore then it becomes a pattern of behavior. What started out as a means to an end, now it's just become conditioned and habitual. So we actually deal with this a lot. This is probably one of the most common questions that we're asked at our center, is how do you deal with a child that won't sleep in their own bed, or they always come into our room at night, or whatever the scenario is. So again, this is power and control. They only have control over so much. Sleeping is one of those things. So obviously, the child is going to want to take control, but it's almost always rooted in anxiety. If we funnel it down, there's almost always high levels of anxiety, because think about it. Throughout the day, anxious kids can be distracted. They can think about other things. They can see other things. They can talk about other things, but they lay in bed at night and there's nothing to distract them. There's no one to talk to. There's nothing to see. There's nothing to do. And they're just alone with their thoughts. And it can be so overwhelming for sensitive, emotional kids, especially if it's anxiety related. It's overwhelming, and they need an escape from it. So the escape is, I need someone, I need something, I need to feel better. Very common. So very similar to the discussion we just had a second ago, we have to have expectations set ahead of time. So let me tell a really quick story. Our son watched a show when I was not home that really scared him. And so for a while, he got really, really nervous about going upstairs and showering when no one else was upstairs.
I've seen those
And
scary shower scenes, Brenna. I know what you're talking about.
okay, so he was like, I just cannot go shower by myself. This is
Never
the worst
again.
thing ever. And I was like, this is what happens when I'm not home. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so, but the moral of the story was, this went on and this went on and this went on. And it was probably a month and a half before his 8th birthday. And I said, all right, buddy, you're going to be 8 soon. And so when you turn 8, you are going to start showering with no one upstairs with you. And here's why we do that: because there's a long enough time in advance that the child can process, they can feel, they can talk, they can think, they can plan, they can prepare. Because look, we all as humans, but kids especially, can handle anything if they're aware that it's coming. If it catches them off guard, they come unraveled. So we can't just go, okay, as of tonight, you're never going to sleep in our
Yeah.
bed again. It has to be a preparation for kids. So by saying, when you turn 8, that gave him 6 weeks. And he knew. I would consistently every week or so remind him, okay, you remember that when you turn 8, you're going to choose to shower upstairs by yourself, because you can do that at 8 years old. And it's a preparation time. Now, sometimes you have to provide choices. Sometimes you have to set limits. So a lot of it is going to be the child-centered play therapy language. You validate the child's feelings, you set neutral limits, and you provide choices. You can choose to shower for 5 minutes, or you can choose to shower for 6 minutes. Which do you choose? You can choose to have music on, or you can choose to have toys in the bathtub. You can choose to have me meet you at the top of the stairs, or you can choose to come downstairs when you're done. There's all kinds of choices that you can provide, but the goal is that the child has enough time in advance to understand what that looks like. So for the bedtime scenario, as of summer, as of Easter, as of spring break, as of whatever time is coming up in the near future, we're going to have different expectations around bedtime. In the past, you've needed us in the room. In the past, you've come into our bed. But moving forward, there's going to be new expectations. Here's what that's going to look like. And you have to help kids prepare for it. And you have to be prepared for the fact that they may struggle with it. But the goal is clear communication, clear expectations, choices when needed, and then the child is able to resign themselves to the fact that things are changing, and they will feel more equipped to handle the transition.
Brenna, I am so sorry. I hope that you can still hear me. For some reason, my audio just stopped working. Oh, the joys of
I can hear you.
live. Okay. All right. You just cut back in. How odd. Okay. Thank you so much for explaining that. That makes perfect sense. And I understand being able to prepare kids, talk to them about it, not spring things on them, but like have it be something that you work up to in the way that you described, that would be really helpful. And you guys, we have just a few minutes left with Dr. Brenna. If you're just joining us, this is Dr. Brenna Hicks, the kid counselor. You can check out her podcast. You can check out her website, drbrenahicks.com. And I think we have time for a couple more of your parenting questions if you're interested. Oh, wait, no, website is brennahicks.com. Brenna, here's actually a really, really good question. And I think we might have talked about this a little bit on the podcast that came out on Monday. But I think that here's like a real world question. Dr. Brenna, can you talk a little bit more about play therapy and helping kids deal with issues around things like being at school, having anxiety at school, maybe a kid who doesn't want to be there, having anxiety around traditions or change, having extreme frustration about being told no or not getting her way. And the question really is, how does therapy help with this stuff? How can we tell if it is working? We have been seeing a play therapist for months now, and it's been okay. My kid loves her play therapist and seems to enjoy playing in her office, but I wonder if it's working. Does there come a point in play therapy with some kind of epic peak happens? For example, my 9-year-old the past 2 weeks has gone from seemingly typical with some anxiety to someone I don't even know. So I'm wondering if things are coming up through play therapy, and if things are coming to a peak or something because nothing else has changed or happened. When you hear this, what is coming up for you?
This is what I hear all the time. That's what's going on.
Really? Oh,
Yeah, okay.
tell us more.
So, yeah, I'll give you my best on that. That's a lot of
Okay.
layers, but
It is. It is a
here's what
lot of
we know.
layers.
Here's what we know. Kids will naturally sit down the older we get. We are naturally wired to play and make sense of things and sort through things in that capacity. So when I hear that a child is dealing with all of those things, school, anxiety, not wanting to go, all the things that were described, if the child is struggling with it, it will come up in play. We just trust that that is the way that it will unfold because that's the way children are wired. As far as the peak of play therapy, as was described, one of the things that we warn parents is that things almost always get worse before they get better. And here's why, especially with highly anxious kids, but with any presenting issue. Kids have been trying to deal with it, trying to stuff it, trying to avoid it, trying to distance themselves from it. They're constantly tamping all of their junk down because otherwise they would come unraveled. Therapy forces them to confront it. Therapy forces them to deal with it. So it's hard, it's tricky, it's difficult, it's exhausting, it's a lot of things. So what typically happens is stuff kind of comes to a head before we actually start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So could this potentially be what you're describing as this the last 2 weeks? It's just everything has magnified so much. That's usually pretty consistent with what we see when a child is finally ready to dive into the work that they need to do. As far as how long does it take, the national average is 30 to 40 sessions. So we know that if a child gets to that 30 to 40 session mark, they usually will have addressed all of the things that they need to. So if you're not to that point yet, there's probably still work taking place in play. And then the play therapist, it's an obligation and a responsibility for the play therapist to keep you informed with what symbolic play is taking place, what themes have emerged in sessions, what are the shifts that the therapist is observing, what can you be doing to support that work at home. So a lot of the therapist's role is to help you be mindful of what is taking place and the why behind it, and then what you can be doing to support that, so that the work that's happening in the playroom is magnified by the work that's taking place in the home.
That's fantastic. And I also want to say too that what you are talking about and what you do, Dr. Brenna, is evidence-based child-centered play therapy. And I just know from my experience that there are parents who just send their kids into a playroom to, like, move dinosaurs around and play with puppets for an hour. And there isn't communication with that therapist. There isn't any instructions about what they need to be doing differently. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, if that's something that you've noticed in the culture, that there are either therapists practicing play therapy, but not actually conducting it by the standards that you just described. And also, perhaps as a piece of this, what was coming up for me in the guidelines you were sharing at the beginning of our conversation is that there's actually a lot of work for parents. There are things that we need to be doing differently in terms of how we communicate with our kids, different ways of kind of structuring things at home. And so with, the evidence-based play therapy, but also a place for like parent coaching as part of that. Or do you feel that if a child is sent to have treatment, so to speak, can that ever work on its own?
Both and.
Okay.
So we know that outcomes are always more positive and
Uh-huh.
more favorable if the parent is involved. So we know that there will be greater gains, there's better longitudinal outcomes the more invested and committed a parent is, and they're doing their work as well. However, we also know that sometimes that's not practical, feasible, or one
Mm-hmm.
of the options. And so the beauty of child-centered play therapy is that children will become more resilient, they will build more coping, they will develop the four universal outcomes that we've talked about, increase self-esteem, increase worldview, increase regulation, increase all the other things that they build as they go
Yeah.
through it. We all of a sudden now see that kids will still do that work, and it helps actually the whole family unit change, even if the parents are not involved directly, because when one person changes, it
Yeah.
changes the whole family dynamic. We know that too. So ideally, of course, the play therapist is going to advocate for the child, equip parents, coach parents, help parents, get them on board, get them changing things at home. But
Mm.
sometimes that isn't possible. And so, therefore, we also trust that as kids heal and grow and they become better versions of themselves, it will naturally change the dynamic in the home just by the one person being involved, not everyone.
That's amazing. No, systems are so powerful. All right. I really appreciate your perspective. And Dr. Brenner, you are just such a wealth of information. And I appreciate your work, but also like not just the work that you do clinically, which is amazing, between working with kids and families, also training the next generation of therapists in evidence-based child-centered play therapy. But you are also just creating a ton of free information to support families, parents, and therapists. You have so many resources on your website. You have a podcast. For people who are just catching a few minutes of this, or like, I need more Dr. Brenna in my life, can you tell us just where to find you, where to hear you?
Sure. So, my parenting podcast would be the first stop, and that is 8 or so years in, and that's playtherapyparenting.com. That is child centered play therapy based parenting coaching. And
Mm.
so, all kinds of topical scenarios. I answer questions that parents write in. I provide everything through a child centered play therapy lens, meaning you can use skills that are empirically supported and we know are effective with children, but it can become a parenting tool rather than a therapeutic tool. And so that would be the first stop along the way. I also have play therapy podcast, but that is a little bit more clinical in nature. But a lot of parents listen to that as well because it provides more depth and deep dive into why we're using the skills and how they work. So if you're that really invested, overachieving, like I really want to know how this works and I really want to just do the deepest dive I can, you could also go to Play Therapy podcast, and there's crossover in those episodes because you'll get the very basic in skills as well as the practical application for parents if you listen to both.
Amazing. Okay, so many fantastic free resources. So you guys got that? Play Therapy Parenting Podcast, and then the Play Therapy Podcast if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. And you also have so many more resources on your website, brennahicks.com. And then what about the Kid Counselor? Are there additional resources there, or is that something you're transitioning out of?
There are. Before I started podcasting, I wrote a ton of blogs. I made a ton of video blogs. So all kinds of resources, again, all through the lens of child-centered play therapy. And the blog articles are actually very practical for parents as well, because it's, how does birth order influence your children? And how do you communicate in your child's love language? And what do you do to eliminate power struggles in the home? And so very topical blog posts that afford parents information on a much more practical, tangible level as well.
This is incredible. All right, you guys, you're going to be busy for a while getting through all of Brenna's amazing free resources. And Dr. Brenna, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. This was very helpful. I learned a lot chatting with you, as always. And I hope to see you another time soon. Come back anytime.
I hope so. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.